Hello, this lecture is on William Wallace, the freedom fighter, a, a Scottish national hero of the late 1290s and early 1300s. William Wallace has generated much interest over the years. With his followers, the Scottish rebel had defeated the English in several encounters. King Edward saw him as England's #1 enemy. For years, the English desired the capture of the elusive Wallace, who they viewed as a bloodthirsty killer. They characterized him as, quote, an ogre of unspeakable depravity who skinned his prisoners alive, burned babies, and forced the nuns to dance naked for him, end quote. For many Scots, he was the great hero of the Scottish Wars of Independence, who embodied the powerful idea of a freedom for those burdened by the actions of English tyrants. Over 80 years before the rise of William Wallace, an important political development took place in England. In the year 1215, the Magna Carta represented liberties granted by King John. The charter occurred under the threat of civil war, and it underwent alterations in 1216, 1217, and 1225. In essence, it was an agreement between an able but completely unscrupulous and opportunistic king and a small group of his barons, some of whom were of disreputable character. In fact, John sent messengers to Rome to persuade the Pope to declare the charter invalid. Pope Innocent sided with the king, but Henry died in 1216 and the Magna Carta survived. By declaring a king or sovereign to be subject to the rule of law and documenting the liberties held by free men, the Magna Carta provided the foundation for individual rights. The documentation of the liberties held by free men was a seminal moment in Western civilization. The Magna Carta contained key assumptions. There was the conception of the free, the privileged man. The 39th clause states that no free man shall be taken or imprisoned or deceased or outlawed or exiled or in any way destroyed, nor will we go against him or send against him except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. The main point was the protection of privileged men from arbitrary action. As time went on, this protection would extend to a greater number of people. However, although provisions of the charter seemed to benefit the ordinary man, a close examination indicates that it was his lord's financial situation that usually mattered most. The free man had freedom to go where he wanted, but he had to swear an oath to a lord. The relationship was meant to be contractual, each party cooperating for their mutual benefit. The lord was expected to consult his vassals on issues relating to the welfare of the fief. He was to seek the counsel of his vassals before choosing a wife for himself or for his eldest son, before embarking on a war, or before going on a long journey. Counsel was a central feature of medieval government. A lord was not to be arbitrary, absolute ruler. Bound by the contract, by the customs forged in his court, his power over a vassal was to be limited. Historian Sidney Painter writes that the terms feudal law and feudal contract, when applied to the feudal states of Western Europe as a whole, are vague generalizations that have little meaning and less utility. But when applied to a single fief, they are extremely concrete. Disagreement between the parties could take place on the issue of military operations. The feudal system assumed the willingness of the feudal class to resort to war. If a vassal defied the decision of his lord's court, his fellow vassals took arms to subdue him. If the lord violated custom, his vassals rose against him. However, it was not always clear to draw the line between irresponsible revolt and justified rebellion against violations of feudal custom. Even if men represented a good cause in their opposition, a strong king could view them as traitors and successfully overpower them. An understanding of the key assumptions of the Magna Carta and its limitations in practice is helpful in exploring English and Scottish history of the 13th century. From 1249 to 1286, King Alexander III ruled Scotland. He was a good king, and these were prosperous years for Scotland. In 1274, Edward I Longshanks became King of England. When Alexander died after falling off a cliff on a dark, stormy night, the Scottish people faced a political dilemma. One historian wrote, "The loss of this excellent king would, in any circumstances, have been a heavy calamity to his country, but the blow could not have been received at a more unfortunate moment." Alexander did not leave an heir to the Scottish throne. His only relative was his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret. A temporary solution was a provisional government until Queen Margaret assumed power. Not satisfied with this arrangement, some Scottish aristocrats rebelled. Peace in Scotland became precarious. Dispute over succession to the Scottish throne resulted in persistent Anglo-Scottish conflict. Upon returning to England after a 3-year stay in Europe, King Edward expelled the Jews, numbering about 16,000, from the kingdom. This speaks to his severe character. He also began plans to take greater control of Scotland. Unwisely, Scottish aristocrats asked him for assistance in deciding who should rule Scotland. England and Scotland had good relations over the previous 100 years. This changed with Edward. In July 1290, Edward arranged the marriage of his 6-year-old son to Margaret, but she died soon after while traveling from Norway to Scotland. With no sovereign, Scotland remained in political turmoil, with various groups continuing to gain the upper hand, including nobleman Robert Bruce. Meanwhile, Edward planned an occupation of Scotland, and the first step was installing Scottish John Balliol, a vassal king who did Edward's bidding. In 1291, Edward took control of all Scottish castles. All Scottish landholders were to swear fealty to Edward. In the next few years, more Scots became angry at English control. The nobles themselves, they whose selfish or factious ambition had laid their country at the feet of the English king, had many of them by this time roused to a sense of the bondage into which they had fallen. Scotland's King John submitted to Edward, that is, until 1295, when he refused to send a Scottish army against Edward's enemy, the French king, Philip IV. In response, Edward sacked the Scottish town Berwick, an important port. The ruthlessness of Edward was on display as his army killed thousands of men, women, and children. Losing their nerve, some Scottish nobles surrendered their castles to the English. In 1296, the English destroyed Scottish forces at the Battle of Dunbar. When the Edinburgh castle fell to the English, King John surrendered. Under English occupation, the Scots suffered greatly with high taxes. Many who did not submit to English dominance lost their lives. Edward put down the Scottish rebellions, but he could not subdue their spirit of resistance. Insurrections broke out periodically. Early attempts to throw off the foreign yoke under which the kingdom groaned had been made under the direction of the government. But now there was no native government, and it was William Wallace who stepped forth to lead the Scots. William Wallace was born in approximately 1272. He was the second son of a minor knight named Sir Malcolm Wallace. The Wallace family was not wealthy. Malcolm's refusal to swear fealty to King Edward was a risky decision. In one violent encounter with the English, Malcolm and his oldest son lost their lives. With the death of his father and brother, William brooded in anger. As a teenager, he received 2 years of education from his uncle, who was a priest. William learned to read and write French, Gaelic, and Latin. It is said that his uncle implanted in Wallace a passionate love of liberty. The Wallace family resented England's dominance of Scotland. Moreover, it is said that the English had murdered William's young wife, Marion. Wallace's resistance to English tyranny was personal, and his acts of violence against the English made him a fugitive. One story is that he killed 3 Englishmen who attempted to steal fish he had caught. Another alleged episode was his killing of several English soldiers during a street brawl. With these exploits, Wallace's fame grew. Wallace began as a captain of a small band that grew in numbers due to his successful engagements with the English. His first organized guerrilla operation was the ambush of 180 Englishmen escorting a supply convoy. The stolen goods included weapons for his band. Wallace was often ruthless. He rarely took male prisoners. He only released English women and children. His courage was legendary. He fought on foot with his men, wielding a large sword. This robber chief earned the nickname Braveheart, and he rose to be a national champion. Some of the major Scottish nobles supported his efforts, including William Douglas, who was in command of the castle at Berwick when the English scored a victory. Especially important was the support of aristocrat Robert Bruce, who admired Wallace's success. Bruce believed that the Pope would absolve him from oath to Edward extorted by force. In July of 1297, near the town of Irving, an English force of 40,000 foot soldiers and 300 cavalry met an almost equal number of Scottish rebels. Scots, however, lacked unity due to jealousies and dissensions. In this miserable state of affairs, it appeared to all who had anything to lose that the wisest plan was to make their peace with the government before it should be too late. The Scottish chiefs laid down their arms after a short negotiation, and for themselves and their adherents made submission to Edward. Sir Andrew Moray of Bothwell was the lone baron who continued to support Wallace. With a large force, Wallace left the field and marched to the north. In the following weeks, Wallace's army had driven the English from the castles of Brechin, Forfar, Montrose, and other northern strongholds. In September, that is September 1297, receiving word that the English were marching to Stirling, Wallace led a force of 40,000 soldiers and 180 cavalry to confront the enemy. Reaching Stirling first, the Scots set up behind the neighboring high grounds and thus were partly concealed. Under the command of Earl of Surrey, the English force was 50,000 strong with 1,000 horsemen. The English offered Wallace terms rather than risk engagement. Wallace refused and goaded the English to fight. On the following morning, September the 11th, the English began crossing a narrow wooden bridge, and Wallace attacked when half of the English had crossed the bridge. The confused English panicked, and thousands were slain or forced into the water. It was a rout, and there were no prisoners taken. Very few Scots died. The impact of the victory was profound. There was nothing less than the almost complete liberation of the country once more from English domination. The English immediately surrendered the castles of Edinburgh, Dundee, Roxburgh, and Berwick. Wallace even marched his army into England. The year 1297 ended well for Wallace. Recognized by even more Scottish aristocrats, he was appointed commander of the army of the Kingdom of Scotland and guardian of Scotland. The Scottish nobles, however, were unenthusiastic with Wallace's opposition to feudalism. This had endeared him to the common folk, but had angered the nobles who stood to lose power and money if feudalism ended. King Edward was detained in Flanders fighting the French, but he returned to England the following year in March and ordered the reassembly of English troops. At the same time, Wallace's army gained strength with many of the Scottish chieftains supporting their national leader. The English army had trouble when a quarrel between English and Welsh soldiers resulted in a mutiny. After this episode passed, the English received positive news that the Scottish were encamped not far from English forces in the wood of the Falkirk. While the English army settled down for the night, Edward's horse, in a fluke occasion, kicked him, busting two of his ribs. In considerable pain, the king mounted his horse in the morning and gave orders for the English to march. It was July 22nd, 1298. One historic account described what followed. Wallace divided the infantry of his army, which was greatly inferior in numbers to that of the English, into 4 circular bodies, armed with lances, which the men protruded obliquely as they knelt with their backs against each other. The archers were placed in the immediate spaces. The horses, of which there were 1,000, were drawn up at some distance in the rear. Edward's cavalry was ranged in the front of his battle in 3 lines. The attack was made at the same time. The shock was gallantly met by the Scottish infantry, and for some time they stood their ground firmly. The cavalry, however, were dismayed by the immense disparity between the numbers of the enemy and their own, or, as had been conjectured, from treason on part of their commanders, fled without striking a blow. And left without support against the repeated charges of the English horse, the lancers and archers also at length gave way, and the rout was complete. An estimated 15,000 Scots fell. One theory is that the aristocrat John Comyn, who had command of the Scottish cavalry, hated Wallace's idea to end feudalism. The non-engagement of the Scottish cavalry was a malicious act by this unhappy noble. Pursued by the English, Wallace retreated with a smaller army to Stirling. The victorious English laid waste to much of the country with sword and fire. Cities such as St. Andrews were burned to the ground. The Scots themselves burned the city of Perth before the English arrived. The cost of war forced King Edward to cease most of his military operations. English citizens were heavily taxed, and merchants suffered high export duties. Edward also seized money from churches and monasteries. Wallace eluded the English until 1305. His capture was due to the treachery of Scottish collaborators. He was brought to Westminster, and one account described the gruesome episode. He was dragged thither at the tails of horses and there hanged on a high gallows, after which, while he yet breathed, his bowels were taken out and burned before his face. The head was afterwards placed on a pole on London Bridge. The right arm was sent to be set up at Newcastle, the left arm to Berwick, the right foot and limb to Perth, and the left to Aberdeen. Over the centuries, the stories of Wallace spoke of a great leader. One mid-19th century historian wrote that Wallace had all the qualities of a popular hero, a strength and stature corresponding to his daring courage. And also it cannot be doubted from the known history of his career, as well as from his traditionary fame, many intellectual endowments of a high order. Vision, military genius, the talent of command, a stirring though rude eloquence, and in every way a wonderful power reaching the hearts of men and drawing them along with him. Above all, an enthusiastic patriotism and a fierce and unextinguishable hatred of the English dominion. These were passions so strong in Wallace, and while he lived, be the hour as dark as it might, all felt that the cause of the national independence never could be wholly lost. As a commander, he attacked when victory was sure and retreated when the risk of his men outweighed the reward. Others were less praiseworthy and wrote of Wallace's headstrong, reckless, and violent characteristics. Wallace has remained a shadowy figure. His life and actions are beset by myths and contradictions. Historian Graham Morton writes that Wallace was a hero who could not be debunked in Scotland. His martyrdom was and remains too vivid in the popular accounts, and the documentary sources are too few. In recent decades, various groups adopted Wallace as their own. Classical liberals saw him as one who challenged the misrule of the aristocracy. He became a symbol for democracy. Socialists saw him as one who fought for the poor. Others saw him as a freedom fighter and national hero who had laid down his life for Scottish liberty. Early 20th century Scottish novelist Lewis Grassic Gibbon wrote that Wallace's ideal was the freedom of our native land. By appearing to embody the idea of a free man, William Wallace made his mark 80 years after the Magna Carta. English rule over Scotland tended to be arbitrary, something that the Magna Carta identified as improper. Was it lawful judgment that singled out Wallace as a traitor? The relationship between King Edward and the Scottish aristocrats was not representative of a contract that benefited both parties. There was little sign of a healthy contractual relationship. The heavy-handedness of Edward soured the Scottish political landscape, further tainted by the greed and jealousies of Scottish nobles. For many Scottish people, Wallace had a strong case for his actions against a brutal occupying force. However, in the end, raw power pushed aside any theory of freedom. Thank you.